woke up this morning, looked at my YouTube channel like I typically do, and I discovered that my Kyle Kulinski Dave Ramsey video was labeled by a human reviewer at YouTube as harassment. This video, where all I do is point out that Kyle Kulisnski clearly has never heard of Dave Ramsey, and I debunk the studies that Kyle Kulisnski mentions but doesn't cite in his video, was deemed by a human at YouTube to be harassment of one Kyle Kulisnski. Absolutely ridiculous on every level, so of course I have to tweak the video, re-upload it, because when YouTube does something like this to your content, they completely suppress the reach of it. So yeah, I'd really appreciate it if you guys watch this all the way through, get that watch time up there, share it out there, make sure this video gets seen in a way that YouTube wasn't letting it get seen because some not smart guy in their review team deemed this video harassment. There's a truism about the media which basically goes like this. If you don't hate somebody in the media, a journalist or a pundit, just wait for them to start talking about something that you yourself are knowledgeable about or actually an expert in, because what you find out about journalists is that they typically have a week to understand a topic before they write about it. TV pundits, they typically have a day, and internet pundits typically take like 30 seconds to get what they want out of a story before they cover it like they actually know what they're talking about. And one of the absolute best examples of this is a man named Kyle Kulisnski. Kyle Kulisnski, the policy wonk, the intellectual of the left, the person that other left-wing figures just repeat, regurgitate, vomit up what he says after consuming it.
Dave Ramsey is a financial advisor. This is a guy who has a radio show. He's been involved in business for a long time. He's worth about $500 million. And he went on Fox News to talk about the peasants and their money troubles during this pandemic and this depression. Let's see what he has to say about stimulus checks.
And a perfect example of Kyle Kulisnski doing exactly what I'm talking about is the way that he covered Dave Ramsey on Fox News, talking about how he doesn't believe there's a need for stimulus checks. And actually, there are deeper problems with people if they need that small amount of money in order to get by. Now, before I get into the substance of today's video, I just want to talk about the title of this video on Secular Talk. Smug elitist says no more survival checks for poor people. Now look, I am no stranger to titling your videos in such a way that will grab attention. However, I do find it incredibly funny that Kyle Kulisnski portrays himself as a policy wonk, and people talk about him as if he's actually knowledgeable about the details of the matters in which he discussed, when in reality, Kyle Kulisnski is 100% emotional appeals. Everything about this title is meant to be emotionally appealing to people in his audience. And by the way, for Kyle Kulisnski to call anybody smug, especially the way that he acts in this video, which is incredibly smug, is unbelievable. But we're going to get into the substance of this video, and you're going to see why Kyle Kulisnski is a buffoon. Just a second, let's roll the clip.
Come from an interesting perspective. You talk to Americans across the country every day on your radio program. Yeah. What do you believe is the right number or the right answer for the next stimulus check?
Well, I don't believe in a stimulus check, because if $600 or $1,400 changes your life, you were pretty much screwed already. You got other issues going on. You have a career problem, you have a debt problem, you have a relationship problem, you have a mental health problem. Something else is going on if $600 changes your life.
Spoken like an asshole with $500 million. Spoken like a guy who doesn't have money problems and is incapable of seeing the world through anybody else's perspective.
Imagine being this aggressively on a platform like YouTube. Kyle Kulisnski clearly just looked up Dave Ramsey's net worth or heard it from somebody else and repeated it without looking into the man any further. Dave Ramsey is somebody who gives people advice on money problems. The way that Dave Ramsey knows personally about money problems is back in the 1980s, he literally lost everything in the real estate market and went bankrupt. So he's made a career since then helping people get to the position where he is, or at least get to a better position through the methods that he used in order to dig himself out of bankruptcy and rebuild his life to a successful place. His entire program is based on his ability to connect, empathize, and help out poor people.
Spoken like a guy who doesn't have money problems and is incapable of seeing the world through anybody else's perspective.
But Kyle Kulinski just saw the $500 million net worth, and he decided that Dave Ramsey's just a bad man that got his career by stepping on the poor, even though he literally counsels poor people on how to get out of debt. And by the way, understanding this is the key to understanding Dave Ramsey's position on the stimulus money, because Dave Ramsey often advocates for people to save up an emergency fund in case of a situation like this, maybe not a pandemic specifically, but in case of situations like this, and not live beyond your means, because eventually you will end up living beneath your means. So his whole shtick is to help poor people. But Kyle Kulinski, the smug elitist, doesn't realize that. He's just looking down on him. He's just like, hoo, this guy has money, therefore he can't connect with poor people. Meanwhile, Kyle Kulinski, almost the #1 person on Patreon, can't connect with poor people, I guess. But hey, that doesn't apply to him because Kyle Kulinski wants you to get survival checks.
Look at how casual and flippant and nonchalant he is about survival checks.
Again, I don't want to overuse this cliche, but when are progressives ever not talking about themselves when they're attempting to insult other people? Also, notice the policy wonk actually says survival checks. Totally policy wonk, not an emotional appeal. Survival checks. Are you against survival? Then you better support these checks. Otherwise, I'm going to say you're against survival. Now, I've been on record multiple times saying that I don't really think that the amount that you get in these one-shot checks is really that significant. In fact, as somebody who's gotten both stimulus checks, and I appreciate it, I spent the money, I enjoyed it, I think it would be way better to increase the amount of unemployment people are getting, because they're actually out of work. I don't actually need the money. Stop giving me checks, if you ask me, would be my answer to the federal government. But Kyle Kulinski called that survival checks, so I guess I'm somehow against my own survival because I don't want $1,400 here or there from the taxpayer when somebody who's unemployed and actually needs that money should probably get that money.
These are survival checks. He says, if $600 or $1,400 changes your life, you were screwed already. But why do people need that money? Maybe it has something to do with the fact that there's a pandemic and a subsequent depression. So it's not like, people woke up one day and decided, I'm going to be extra lazy today and have no moral core or work ethic.
Well, the reason they need the money, Kyle, is not really because of the pandemic. It's actually because of the government response to the pandemic. The response where they shut down all of these businesses, forcing people to be laid off and actually be dependent on money from the government in order to just get by. Now, if we actually opened up businesses, which Kyle Kulinski is not in favor of. Kyle Kulinski supported the lockdowns. He thinks they're scientific. He's somebody who's attacked Florida relentlessly, despite the fact that they're doing way better and didn't lock down, so their economy's doing better. Then we wouldn't have to be in this situation in the first place. And yeah, when you're faced with a government-instituted depression because they're locking down the entire economy, $1,400 isn't really going to solve everything. So Dave Ramsey, 100% right, when he points out that if $1,400 or $600 is going to make or break your life, you do have more serious problems. These people would be way better off if we actually opened up the economy and let people go to work, let them assess their own risks. We're getting the vaccine, we're getting herd immunity up. Hopefully we're getting to the point where government cannot be able to get away with these lockdowns any longer, and these problems will be alleviated.
It's not like people woke up one day and said, let me stop trying. It's that the situation was out of their control. It was out of everybody's control. And there are consequences to a pandemic and a depression. And so people are dealing with that reality the best they can.
Dave Ramsey didn't imply that there wasn't a pandemic. Dave Ramsey didn't imply that the lockdowns weren't causing people to hurt significantly economically. He didn't infer it in any way, shape, or form. Kyle Kulinski right here is counting on the fact that the people in his audience won't bother to look up Dave Ramsey, won't bother to look up the clip, won't bother to look up multiple other clips where Dave Ramsey is discussing these very same issues in a longer format. The guy's a radio show host because he's just trying to smear him with this small snippet of a clip that he shows in this video. The worst looking clip in isolation, if you've never heard of the guy, and all you heard from Kyle is that he has $500 million, is what Kyle is showing you, because Kyle is deceptive. He's an emotional manipulator, and again, has nothing to do with policy, facts, logic, reason at all whatsoever.
And so really, when we talk about stimulus checks, we're just talking about the government giving the people their own money back.
The absurdity of this from a guy like Kyle Kulisnski who thinks that the government taking less of your money, a tax rate cut, somehow amounts to the government giving you something, when in reality they're just letting you keep what you actually earned, is absolutely ridiculous on its face, and I don't have to explain it any further.
I mean, guys, don't take my word for it. You go look at the economic numbers. It's staggering. Even before the crisis, nearly 80% of Americans were living paycheck to paycheck. That's before. Nearly 80% of Americans were living paycheck to paycheck.
This is what I absolutely love about Kyle Kulisnski and what his audience absolutely hates about my responses to Kyle Kulisnski, because unlike other people who don't even bother to insert statistics or mention statistics in the videos that they put out, Kyle Kulisnski at least repeats a statistic that he saw in a headline that when you actually look it up, you can use to debunk everything that he's saying. So this number, the 80% of people living paycheck to paycheck before the pandemic, should ring false to you immediately. And the reason it should ring false to you immediately is because it's absurd on its face, absolutely ridiculous, yet Kyle Kulisnski vomits it up because he probably saw one of the headlines of one of the articles I'm going to go over for you before I go into the study. Now, by the way, the survey comes from careerbuilder.com, and surprise, surprise, when you actually get past the headline, what they found was not that 78% of people live paycheck to paycheck like Kyle Kulisnski saw in the headline, thought it confirmed his priors, and decided to run with. What they actually found was that people don't save any money when they should be saving their money. Now, when I found this article, I knew for a fact that I was going to find some absolutely ridiculous things in it. First and foremost, I'm going to highlight some of the bullet points in this Forbes article before I go on to the actual data itself. And one of the most obvious things that should, stick out to somebody who actually reads these articles is that according to this Career Builder survey, nearly 1 in 10 people making over $100,000 a year say that they live paycheck to paycheck. Now, call me crazy, call me ridiculous, call me an insane person, but if you make over $100K a year and you're living paycheck to paycheck in the United States of America, I believe that puts you in the top 10% in this country, if not very close to the top 10%, then you have a spending problem, you have a debt problem, you have a you problem. This is not a systemic problem. Also, 1 in 4 workers don't set any savings aside a month, period, which again goes to our spending problem and not saving enough problem, not a systemic problem in the root of capitalism. But the cherry on top of the sundae that is Kyle just reading the headlines and not going through the article to find out what this information actually says is that 38% of the people that Kyle Kulisnski counts in that 78% because he saw it in a headline say that they sometimes will live paycheck to paycheck, meaning sometimes at some point during the course of a year, they will spend one of their paychecks and need their other paycheck to have any more money. Sometimes. That's 38%. That's nearly half of the 78% of people living paycheck to paycheck that Kyle Kulisnski is referencing. Now, call me crazy, call me a bit insane, but if you sometimes, meaning like once, twice, an entire year, live paycheck to paycheck, that's not the same thing. It doesn't evoke the same image. You're not giving me the same information as somebody who's always living paycheck to paycheck.
Nearly 80% of Americans were living paycheck to paycheck.
Now, if you think I'm done clowning on Kyle Kulisnski for the stat that he presented that he clearly doesn't know anything about, because, you didn't read further than the part that I highlighted in the first part of this speech on this stat, then you're sadly mistaken, because the next category are people who usually live paycheck to paycheck. Not all the time, but more times than not. And that represents about 17% of the American population, which means that the total amount of people, according to this Career Builder online survey, living paycheck to paycheck is 23%. So we're at about a fourth of what Kyle Kulisnski was highlighting as an actual stat in the United States of America prior to the pandemic. Now, it could be higher during the pandemic. A lot of people are struggling because of the lockdowns that lefties are still pushing for, but we're at about a quarter of what Kyle Kulisnski was actually saying was true, which is reflected in reality. Nice job, Kyle. Really nailed it by not reading it. The policy wonk going off the headlines. Real deep thinker. Smart guy right here. Now, I'm going to jump back to the original article because I think this has some good points in it that I want to highlight because this refers to things that Dave Ramsey talks about on his radio show all the time, and that is this stat, that 28% of people either usually or always live paycheck to paycheck, making between $50,000 a year and $99,000 a year, and 70% of these people report being in some form of personal debt. Also, the survey found that only 32% of workers overall actually budget out their spending, and 56% of people save $100 or less a month. These are all bad choices, and let me emphasize for Kyle Kulinski, who doesn't believe in this concept, the word choices. If you make between $50,000 a year and $99,000 a year, you should be able to save $100 a month. In fact, every single financial planner will tell you to tuck at least $100 a week into some kind of investment account, because if you start that at age 20, by the time you retire, you'll have $1 million extra dollars in your retirement going forward. By the way, this is all stuff that Dave Ramsey preaches to his audience. People who Kyle Kulinski doesn't think Dave Ramsey can relate to, even though all he does on his show basically is talk to these exact people about their personal problems and walk them through that. And what's even funnier than that is the number one recommendation on this article, and you can find similar recommendations in the Career Builder overall package that they presented this information in, is for people to start an emergency fund. And I know there are Dave Ramsey listeners in my audience that have gone through the program and said that Dave Ramsey has helped them. What's the first step of the program? I haven't done it personally, but I know for a fact it's start an emergency fund.
40% of Americans are food insecure. And that was, a few months back in the middle of this pandemic and depression. 40% of the country. So is the idea that, 40% of the country is just really lazy or something, and they got to work harder to get their food? How stupid do you have to be?
So without any doubt, the forced government lockdowns on our economy have definitely left a lot of Americans in a bad place that they likely would not have found themselves in under normal circumstances. However, I always like to watch out for weaselly words and weaselly terms. And food insecure is one of these weaselly terms, as food insecure is defined as the disruption of food intake or eating patterns because of lack of money and other resources. Now, the reason I don't like this term is because it doesn't accurately convey the information people think it conveys when you actually mention it. So this doesn't mean that 40% of Americans are going hungry. What this means is that when the government locked down the economy, disrupting a whole bunch of people's jobs, a lot of people had to make eating habit changes or eating pattern changes, maybe skip some meals due to the fact that they were financially insecure due to the lockdowns. Now, this is a problem. It's definitely something that we should be concerned about, but it's not the same thing as saying that people in third world countries are going hungry. And the reason I bring up third world countries is not to say things could be worse, you could be in a third world country, but it's to show the inefficiency of using this term as something to talk about when referencing food. So if you have a place with poor nutrition as the norm, but people are not having their normal eating patterns disrupted, like in a third world country, then they're not considered food insecure. But if you have an American diet, which honestly has way too much calories, and your food is being disrupted, you're changing your eating habits due to finances, then that could lead to a situation where we say we in the West, who are definitely overeating and overweight, are more food insecure or have more food insecurity than people that are actually starving or at the near point of starving because their normal diet is so lacking in nutrition and calories.
And let's be clear, the system has been rigged in favor of the wealthy for a very long time. I'm thinking about that Rand Corporation study, which found that basically from 1974 until today, the top 1% has stolen $47 trillion from the bottom 90%. Again, this isn't Kyle Kulisnski speaking, this is a Rand Corporation study speaking. What they say is, if you just keep the wealth distribution the same as it was after World War II, when we had stronger unions, better regulation, and things of that nature, if you keep the wealth distribution the same, the bottom 90% would be $47 trillion wealthier.
So to be fair to Kyle Kulinski, he actually did give an accurate summation of the Rand Corporation report. However, the idea that people stole this money from the bottom 90% is where he's completely inaccurate. There is no law at all whatsoever of economics that says the post-war boom, the distribution of income during that time, would be the distribution of income throughout the end of time, if not for rigging the system. Remember, this is a time period when there was not that much competition with American companies and factories in the marketplace because the world economies were destroyed, except for the United States of America, during World War II. This artificially raised the price of labor in the United States of America. Furthermore, we've already talked about how unionization happened a lot in the Rust Belt, and those factories could not relocate because the cost of transportation required them to be near water sources. Also, it was too hot in the South for those companies to locate to the South because you couldn't do manufacturing without boiling the people that were working for you. In the 1970s, both of these things changed. The cost of transportation decreased significantly, so much so that it's barely even a factor considered when running a business, and air conditioning was invented so people can open up factories in the South. So the conditions that allowed the boom to happen in the certain areas in this country and certain industries in this country in the 1970s to all the way back to World War II are not really present anymore because world economies exist. They've been rebuilt. New economies have been built. They compete with our labor, and we don't have to rely on manufacturing in the Rust Belt because transportation is virtually a non-factor. So yeah, the 1% didn't steal $47 trillion or anything from the bottom 90% post-1975. Furthermore, this only works as a calculation if you assume that, it's a zero-sum game and people make money by stealing your money, which is ridiculous, and that if you were to somehow, through legislation, try to force the same redistribution that was happening post-war up until 1975, that the economy would grow at the exact same rate. And there's absolutely no evidence that if you were to try to put all those crazy market controls on the economy, that would be the case. Remember, the greatest period of growth in human history was during the Gilded Age, which had the most income inequality. The economy grows the fastest in an unequal way. That's how it all works. So if you try to force a distribution of wealth in the United States of America that was based on the fact that all the world economies were destroyed and that transportation was a significantly higher cost of doing business than it is today, in the name of reducing inequality, that would definitely have led to economic contractions compared to the amount of growth that we had since 1975.
There's this mindset, this pervasive mindset on the far right. It's this idea that it's some flaw in your character if you're struggling with money issues. There has to be something wrong with you if you're struggling with money issues. But that presupposes that the system makes sense and is already a meritocracy. And of course, the system doesn't make sense, and it's not a meritocracy. There are people who work full-time jobs and they don't make enough money to survive. The minimum wage is not a living wage.
So here you have Kyle saying, it's not a meritocracy, but let me advocate for raising the minimum wage beyond the point of what merit would actually require somebody to be paid to an arbitrary line that he set. Obvious contradiction right there. Just wanted to point it out before he gets into this ridiculous other point.
Could you imagine working a full-time job and still not making enough money to survive? And this guy turns around and blames you as if you did something wrong. No, perhaps the system needs changing.
Yes, Kyle, I can imagine that because I have worked and made not enough money to survive, which was fine because I was in college and I was at home and I didn't need to make enough money to survive like the overwhelming majority of people who work full-time at the minimum wage in this country. Remember, the amount of people that are in poverty that work full-time jobs is incredibly low in the United States of America. It's something like 5% of the people in poverty actually work full-time. The number one problem with people in poverty is that they don't work or they work part-time. So Kyle is once again miles away from any factual basis in what he's saying. A lot of people work jobs that they don't make enough to survive because they don't need to. They're entry-level positions. They're rungs on the ladder meant to help you ascend to a higher plane in terms of your economic status. Now, Kyle believes in his heart, and I'm sure this is true, that he's helping people up that ladder and ascend further economically, but in reality, what he's doing is cutting down the first rungs of that ladder, making it more difficult for people to grow. A lot of times what you see with minimum wage increases is the increase in unpaid internships or internships that are just pseudo-employment that offer you some kind of a stipend that's lower than the minimum wage. That's because for a lot of people starting out, they do not merit a higher wage. This ends up hurting the unskilled workers who can't get started and need to build up the experience in order to make more money later in life.
The fact that we have a government that's so bought and owned by the wealthy that they get bailed out quickly and the people get crumbs. You know, that's the other part of this. They never, like, these guys never said anything like this when it came to Wall Street bailouts, for example.
So Kyle Kulinski is just making things up about Dave Ramsey. He's not bothering, as Stephen Michael Davis pointed out he did to Morning Joe, to even watch a little bit of the content of the person that he's criticizing. To say that Dave Ramsey never criticized the Wall Street bailouts has to be the most absurd, insane thing that you could possibly say about the guy. He's all about people paying their own debts and not intervening in the market to bail people out. And you think that he didn't criticize them because you didn't bother to look into it because you don't care. You saw $500 million in net worth and you thought rich man bad, so you decided to do this hit job against him. You know it's bad when the Young Turks did a video on this exact video from Fox News.
So where's my slight defense? So a couple of them. Number one, he's from talk radio and they talk like this all the time. And his show is, if you ever listen to Dave Ramsey's show, it's nonstop, cut up your credit cards. The problem isn't your debt. The problem is what led to your debt. So he's speaking in that lingo, but he's doing it in a format that doesn't know the rest of his context. So it comes out as particularly ugly, right?
And Cenk Uygur, the strawmanner of all strawmanners, Cenk Uygur, who just came off of making a video celebrating the death of Rush Limbaugh, that's how nasty of a guy he is, actually gave Dave Ramsey the benefit of the doubt because he's actually had conversations with Dave Ramsey and Dave Ramsey's actually helped the Young Turks grow.
Now, my second defense is biased. So I'm giving you that warning ahead of time. Dave Ramsey, for no reason at all, when TYT was first starting out, helped us when no one else did. Just like advice and helpful stuff and calls here and there. Nobody ever does that. He talked to Dave Kohler and walk us through stuff. So he's a Christian. He talks about Jesus all the time, but he's a rare Christian that actually means it. So, I'm just giving you that background.
And Cenk, unlike Kyle, actually is aware of some of the work that Dave Ramsey does and isn't just making up nonsense and talking out of his backside. You know you've lost the plot when Cenk Uygur is being more reasonable and more charitable to somebody on the right than you are. Complete and total fail by Kyle Kulisnski on every possible level. Anyway, that's all I really have for you guys today. Let me know what you think about this debacle from Kyle Kulisnski down in the comments below. If you like this video, then you can show me by leaving a like. If you want, you can subscribe for more content. Follow me on all my social medias. They are linked in the description. You can support me via the support links. This has been me making fun of Kyle Kulisnski because he doesn't know anything. Till next time.